Aí a presença, a gente está bem honrado de ter a presença do professor Christopher Budd. Agora ele está como professor na Universidade de Delft, trabalhou o doutorado dele na Cass Business School em Londres, e ele trabalha há muitos anos na City de Londres. E a razão da gente trazê-lo aqui, claro, era uma oportunidade, porque ele estava aqui próximo, em condições, mas ele tem trabalhado muito com o que está por trás de tudo que o Keynes propôs na época antes de Bretton Woods, né? E que são coisas que também estão no pensamento do Rudolf Steiner. Rudolf Steiner é uma pessoa que não é conhecida como economista, ele é muito mais conhecida como uma pessoa espiritualista e de outras áreas. E ele tem explorado exatamente essa ligação entre os dois. Então, queremos agradecer a presença dele. Ele vai fazer a palestra em inglês, tá? Então, é uma boa oportunidade para vocês irem melhorando o inglês de vocês. E, em todo caso, agradeço aí. Vocês ficam à vontade de fazer pergunta. O Xavier se prontificou a, talvez, fazer algumas explicações em português. Just to tell you, so I presented you briefly and said that Xavier, if very much needed, can do some kind of a translation or talking in Portuguese for them. Okay. Todo mundo entende inglês aqui, né? Essa é a condição para vocês entrarem no mestrado, né? Então...
Okay.
Beleza? Então é isso. Please,
yeah?
feel free,
okay. So,
use your time,
yeah.
We will be listening to you.
Okay. So, good afternoon, everybody. I would say if you don't understand, just say so, and Xavier will explain. There's no point sitting there thinking you understand if you don't, or pretending you understand when you don't. So don't feel, I'm happy to be interrupted. Now, what I wanted to do was share some thoughts, make a presentation, and then see what response, if any, there is, and then maybe take that a bit further. And I work like this because I'm English. I have to be very careful not to do what English economists do, which is enter the room using their own language, telling you how to understand economics. This is a subtle form of imperialism. And we've been very busy over many years providing you with the vocabulary of what today is called economics. So from Marshall onwards, we've been very active. And it looks like a scientific discipline, which it is, kind of. But on the other hand, it's very handy for the English as a way of kind of organizing the world. And that means that as an English person, I use the English language, and I might say things which you understand one thing, I mean another. So this is how we run the world, and I can give you many examples, just one. In New Zealand, when we created the Waitangi Treaty between the Maoris and the British, they had no codified land registration or anything like this, but we had one, and so we created a treaty which reflected our paradigm, not theirs. And they signed it, and to give an example, they didn't realize that meant they could only fish on certain days. Because for the Maori, they never fished more than they could eat. That was how they regulated their economy. But for the English, you regulate the economy by fishing on certain days only. And so they signed this treaty. It's a very simple example. And this has caused huge problems in New Zealand ever since. The conflict between a paradigm which doesn't write down such things and manages to be ecological, and a paradigm which does write things down like this and manages to be very unecological. And it's a very important story because this was only resolved about 4 or 5 years ago in New Zealand when the British said sorry and they had to pay a certain amount of reparations to the Maori. So I give this example because there are many things in economics as a discipline and in economic policy which emanate from this place that I come from. And I always like to say, if I'm not in England, be very careful, you're listening to an English person. And as a Dutch colleague of mine once said, that means a duplicitous person. Or as Napoleon put it, perfidious Albion, the English who lie through their foreign policy. They say one thing and they mean another. And just to end this little anecdote, as our Prime Minister Eden said at the end of the Suez crisis, it's not our problem that the French didn't understand we weren't telling the truth. So I say that to deconstruct myself and to put you on red alert, but also because for me it's a very important problem. The way the world has developed economically is largely at the behest of our understanding of how things should be. Not only in political terms, you might say, but it's the way we think. And for me, this is a huge problem. It's well expressed if I do it in terms of monetary policy, because if we being the Anglo-Saxons, convince you to undertake central bank independence, to stabilize your currency in 1994, to make the bank independent and all this stuff, that's normal for us because we live in cold climates. And we think it's normal that everyone should do this, even if they don't live in cold climates, because we think it's a virtue to have no inflation. And this you achieve through central bank independence. So I give that, I give that example because we then have huge influence in the world, but what we don't perceive in doing this is what those countries like Brazil would have done if left to themselves. So, and now I'm saying this because the foundation of monetary policy and central bank independence was very interestingly described by Milton Friedman, believe it or not. He's not entirely evil, this guy. There's some very interesting jewels in among all the other stuff. And one of them is from, I think, the essays in 1966, in which he says of monetary policy, what's important is that every country in the world follows monetary policy according to its own light. That's almost poetry from the point of view of someone like Milton Friedman. But what that means is, or what I think it means is, you have to figure out what is essential to the country in which this monetary policy is going to be applied. And in England it is, we don't do inflation. That's normal for us, we pretend. And so that's an immediate fit for our way of being. It may not be a fit for every country. And when I was doing my doctorate, which included a study of the central bank here, we had this interesting discussion. What would that mean in the case of Brazil? And I said, oh, that's easy. If you think of every country has its own light, you need to find a word which sums up this country. So like liquidity sums up England. And he said, so what would you say for Brazil? I said, that's easy, the people who dance. So I wouldn't develop Brazil by industrializing, if I can make a comment. I would say, what does the people that dance look like if they follow this out into monetary policy? It's not entirely, it's a true story, but it's also the question I asked of New Zealand once, because New Zealand has no industry, but they have fantastic opera singers, they do fantastic design, fantastic internet stuff, but no industry, and they never created an industrial revolution. It's not necessary. So this is I'm throwing out various things, because this is how I deconstruct myself, because what I want to do is share some thoughts with you, very specific, but as a pretext in a way to find out what's living in the room here, what's living in you, and what's living in Brazil. So yes, I've come to share certain precise thoughts, but really I want to do this as a way of hearing what's living here, and that's why I want to make a presentation, have some discussion, and then work with what's here, not just with what I brought. This is my method. Then I feel I haven't just done a kind of English trick on everybody. And it's very easy to do an English trick because we make it a requirement that everyone will speak English. And that's our starting point. And that sounds innocent enough until you know what's important in English is not what's said, but what isn't said. And then you can speak perfect English and you still won't know what they were talking about. So we have to be very careful. Now, luckily, Portuguese is a kind of English version of Spanish. So you have a kind of, if I can put it like this, you have a kind of way of speaking which is much more English than Spanish. It's on that side, it's touching the Atlantic, and you were our competitors in developing a world economy. The Spanish never, right? They just knew how to come and take gold and ship it back and spend it. But the Portuguese were rivals in creating a world economy before it all went up to Holland. Right? But then it moved to London, and there it's been ever since. Now, I'm throwing out all sorts of things. Partly, I'm having fun, but they're all fairly concrete things I'm saying if you look into economic history. And I'm trying to contextualize this discussion by placing what I want to talk about in that context of economic history, particularly since the 16th century, 17th century, when you could say the whole locus of at least economic, certainly financial evolution culminated in Amsterdam and then moved to London, has never moved anywhere else since. When it came to London, it became the center of the worldwide financial system. And that locus point, I think it's still the case. So that's my understanding. And then what I want to look at in that context is, so where did that go? And primarily where that went was when things moved to London, this is at the late 18th century, early 19th century, at the same time as the financial district, so to move from Amsterdam to London, we kind of invented the gold standard. Kind of, because you can't say we invented it, but Newton, Isaac Newton, who discovered the law of gravity, he was also the master of the mint. And this is a much more interesting Newton than the one of gravity. And therefore, he was really the father, or the inventor, you could say, of the gold standard, with which we, the British, then ran the world economy for the next 100 years, more or less. Just a little sideline, the gold standard, which expressed an ounce of gold in sterling, the value that Newton put on it was slightly different to the value that Parliament put on it. That's already a little story. So the essential gold standard in economic terms was not the political value that the British government put on it. It's like putting your fingers on a scale if you're a vendor in a shop. Yeah. So that's a little detail, but it's an important detail because the gold standard as such had a certain economic validity, but when we change the value in Parliament, now we're politicizing this instrument. And that's a huge matter in world history. So 100 years later, the end of the 19th century, we entered into the so-called heyday of the gold standard, the height of the British Empire, quote unquote. But at that point, we had a huge problem, we the British, because there was a system now working, what in economic historians call takeoff. So Britain had to go through all the process of having industrial revolution and so on. But once you see this process, then you can replicate it. This is a well-known phenomenon. And at that point, at the late 19th century, the Germans had seen this process, and so they replicated it. And so to speak, they began with brand new computers, and the English was still on typewriters. So this is a huge important detail in economic history. The whole locus of economic history was heading towards Germany because they could just outcompete the British. This may seem a strange thing to say, but I'm saying this because that was the primary context for us, the British, at the end of the 19th century. Germany is about to outcompete us, financially speaking. On the other side, our American cousins were thinking it was time for them to run the world, and it was time for the dollar to replace sterling already then. And I'm giving this context because the huge question then was, what happens at the end of the heyday of the gold standard when it no longer operates? Does it shift to another hegemon country like the United States, or what happens? And what happened was you had the First World War, and I think on the 2nd of August 1914, the gold standard was suspended. You may know all this history. I'm giving it because at that date, the £1 was worth $4.8. And when the war finished, putting it very simply, all the economic relationships in the world have been destroyed and completely reconfigured in reality. But we came back to the gold standard, or to the exchange rate between the dollar and the pound at the pre-war rate. This is a very important consequence. The question was that rate real? Could the gold standard continue? And the answer to that, in principle, was no, it was not real, and no, the gold standard could not continue. And that problem is still the problem behind all modern economic situations today. So I'm giving you that context to provide a starting point, which is very specific. And I am going to talk about Rudolf Steiner, but I want to talk about it through that circumstance. Because Rudolf Steiner, you may know or not know about. He's very little known in academia. But that problem is very well known. It's the pivot of modern economic history, even today. What will replace the dollar? And don't say gold, because that won't work. And now, why I'm saying this, because that was a historical circumstance in which Rudolf Steiner, in this case, gave a series of lectures, 14 lectures. I'm not going to bore you with them, but they're very important lectures. They're very interesting lectures for me, at least in terms of economic history, and I will touch on them a little bit. But because they were given at the same time that John Maynard Keynes was writing his book called A Tract on Monetary Reform. And because I know you have a kind of affinity with Keynes here, I want to bring that in early on. Because the Tract on Monetary Reform was, and for me, is absolutely critical in understanding modern finance and the modern situation. And I want to draw an image of, my image of what Keynes was, the basic problem Keynes was describing and trying to address, and I would say address fairly successfully, but I don't want to go into that detail. If my image, he didn't draw this image, but this is my way of explaining it. You had, before, when the gold standard operated, you had 1 ounce of gold, and you had a hegemon economy, so the main economy, which at that point was Britain. And you would say 1 ounce of gold is £3.17 and 6p or something like this. And from there, through the world economic relationships, you could then identify all the foreign exchange rates. So the dollar was, £1 was $4.8, and so on around the world. So that's how the foreign exchange rates were established under the gold standard. You had a physical thing, 1 ounce of gold, possessed by the hegemon economy. And from this, you then work out all your parities as a simple drawing. And Keynes said, the problem is this ounce of gold is the problem. He called it a kind of barbaric relic, sort of, meaning if you just rely on gold, that's okay if it's a static amount, right? But if you suddenly discover a lot of gold in Russia or in South Africa or in California, then your reference point is now moving. And that's like saying you have a centimeter, which actually is this big. So you can no longer use gold as a reference if your centimeter is getting bigger or smaller. That was his way of describing this problem. And it's a metaphor for how you think. Because if you think like this, you think you are the hegemon economy. And so the problem he described was the fixed point becomes the fixed point which I use, gold goes out of the window, and all these economies have to find the point at which they strike off. So there is no hegemon in that image, and the fixed point is now moving. It moves from day to day. It's like a price. So I use this image because that's the tract of monetary reform. And for many people in finance, which is my field, this is still the Bible, actually. Everyone goes back to the tract of monetary reform because this is still the problem. Now, I brought that in because I think a way to show the relevance of Rudolf Steiner and to show almost the relevance too of Keynes, in my opinion, is to start with this problem. which has not gone away. It's still there. Today, we'd like to think we have monetary policy and central bank independence around the world and more or less universally floating exchange rates, but it's not the case. And so we still have the problem, what's going to replace the gold, the US dollar, and which country will that be? We still think in these terms. So that's still the central problem. And now, why I'm describing in this way is as a way of describing this problem, which you can find in Steiner, but you find it also in someone like George Soros. I don't know if you're allowed to study George Soros here, The Alchemy of Finance. But what Steiner says about this is, so how do we think and how do we organize ourselves if no one person is going to call the shots? That's his basic problem. If no one country is going to run the world, how are we going to, what's going to happen? It's a huge question and a huge problem. But it's also a metaphor for our epistemology. If I'm not going to start with this thought, but whatever's in this room, so if it's not you sitting here accepting what I'm saying and agreeing or otherwise, but finding something which we can all own, that's the same problem. And so Soros describes this. I'm putting this very shortly. Soros describes this in his book, The Alchemy of Finance, in a very interesting way, when he says, and he studied at the LSE, so he studied equilibrium theory and so on, and what he says in The Alchemy of Finance is, if you come into the financial markets, you have to realize equilibrium theory does not operate. What operates is reflexivity. So to put it very simply, you have cause and then effect, and then you have reverse causation. The effect cause a cause, and now you keep traveling from one to the other, and now you become what in English we call a swift, a bird that's forever on the wing and never comes to rest. And so he described in the financial markets, there is no such concept as equilibrium. And then he says, and once you get to this point, then you realize, nor is there any such concept in the real economy. And this is the controversy, if you like, about Soros. People say, just stick to your world, don't come into ours. But his point is, once you realize in the financial markets that the thing that's operating is reflexivity, then you realize that's also what's operating in the real economy. And then you realize that general equilibrium theory, anything which has the idea that you're at rest, belongs to the old order. It requires there to be a hegemon country and so on. And in effect, it requires you to have a gold standard or something like it. So the Americans tried for 40 years to run the gold exchange standard until they gave up in 1971. And then it sneaked into the IMF as the backing for the SDR. So it hasn't gone away, it's just because, and it won't go away until we understand that this is a kind of image of how we have to think and how we also have to organize the world. So if you accept that, and that's my thesis professionally, and I can demonstrate it, I feel, through Keynes, but also that's where, for me, Steiner comes into the frame in a way to show that he's relevant and on the pulse. However remote he may be from anyone's understanding and however strange his stuff may appear. So I wanted to start with this problem of reflexivity, and then risk, describing that in another way, risk meaning I'm technically an economic historian, which means I'm not an economist in professional terms. It means I don't have to do numbers, which means I don't have to do algebra, which means I don't have to understand what I'm about to explain to you, right? So if it's not right, you have to tell me, but I'm going to say, fine, I'm interested, right? So this is very important. At this point, I cover myself professionally by saying, I'm an economic historian. I'm not an economist of the kind that you might be. So the problem that this implies, if I understand it, and I'm also not a mathematician because historians don't do maths, a way of describing this is how do you think with multiple independent variables? right? So how do we, if I was not to speak English, if I was to have to speak Portuguese when I came to Brazil, or Spanish when I went to Argentina, or French in France, where would I be? As long as I can say it's all going to be done in English, I'm running the show. The minute I can't use my language and my cultural references, I'm at sea. Do you understand what I'm describing? And I'm not only at sea, I'm at the mercy, I depend really on understanding, so how do people think in their own culture, in their own country? For me, this is a real thing, and that was my question to the Central Bank of Brazil. So what really would the Brazilian people do if we stopped interfering in your country, either directly through lending you capital or indirectly through preaching central bank independence as a virtue that any self-respecting human being would adopt? Because that's kind of how we go about it. What would you do if left to yourself? And I think it's a very crucial question. This is Milton Friedman's question. Yes, you can have a single concept of monetary policy, but the next step is, if you left every country to follow its own light, where would that take us? And what he says is, very interesting, it would take us to a world in which nobody exported their problems to another country. So it's a very, it's essentially a concept which stabilizes the entire world economy, except we just haven't gone there. But this is from Milton Friedman. So there I want to say to those who think like this about Milton Friedman, you have to see the baby in the bathwater, always, and see the jewels in the sand. So that's the kind of image that this is thinking with multiple independent variables. It's first, on the first side, it's epistemological, it's immediately institutional, so that's also interesting. So I don't get in fights as to where you begin. You can start with deconstructing the World Bank if you like. You're going to have to think like this if you're going to do that. But if you're going to think like this, you're going to have to rearrange the World Bank. It's going to have to get out of Washington and travel around the world, at different headquarters once a year or something. Like it used to be for the organization which was then got rid of, when you had the IMF and the World Bank as institutions, you had the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade with the Secretariat in Geneva. This the Americans didn't like, nor the French. So they were only too happy to have a World Trade Organization as an organization in a place. But the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was a multilateral agreement which had a secretariat, and it wasn't an organization. This is very, very important. So it belonged to this kind of story. And now, an example I want to give you straight from Steiner, and it's the kind of core example. I want to give you two, which I'm only giving you to kind of illustrate what I think is this problem and how he addresses it. The first one is he cites, quotes, he refers to standard supply and demand theory from Adam Smith in the 18th century, the late 18th century. He actually says it's a pity Adam Smith couldn't think clearly enough. Because then he would see, yes, this is true, price is a function of supply and demand, but so this is true. But from a different point of view. But the thinking is the same. And then this is also true, but from a different point of view. So I'm using the same thinking as I walk around the tree. And this is just epistemology. I've not yet changed the way I think. I'm just looking at this problem from here, then I'm looking at it from here, and I'm looking at it from here. And then I could give you the detail of this, but I won't at the moment. And then what Steiner says in his lectures is then we come to a new magnitude. And this is just one example on why I think he's an important economist. Because he takes our normal understanding, total normal basis of normal economics, and then says, yes, but you can think of this in different ways, and then you arrive at a different place. And this place is here. if you see what I'm saying. So this place, this is a dependent variable, here's two independent variables. And here I have multiple independent variables. And so that's my understanding of what Steiner's getting to. This is like this in Keynes' work. Where am I when I'm not in charge of the most important economy in the world? Right? Where am I when I'm not, what's her name now? Not Bernanke, the lady who's now in charge of the Fed. Where am I when I'm not this person? When I don't have that control? This is very important stuff. So that's one example. The other one I want to give, just so you have a kind of factual piece of information, was for Rudolf Steiner, the whole economic problem was a little bit like Keynes, a bit of a no-brainer. So for Keynes, he had this wonderful image. He actually got it from George Moore, but it's a wonderful image. What is the economic problem, said Keynes. The economic problem is we have to figure out a way whereby everybody is fed, healthy, sheltered, so they can do fine actions, which is a reference to Aristotle. So it's very important to see in Keynes that he contextualizes everything he was doing in economics as trying to solve the economic problem, which was, in his mind, that everybody in the whole world should be able to be fed, housed, able to function, so they can do what's really important in their lives. And he called this fine actions, which is a reference to Aristotle. So you can translate that into, so when are we going to get into a situation where there is no poverty in the world? It's a way of describing inequitable distribution of wealth has ended in Keynes' mind. This is where we're all trying to get to. And we can discuss all sorts of ways where that's going to be achieved. But I think it's very important, if you're thinking of Keynes, to have a little bit of a poetic understanding of what he was trying to do. Because that was his very conscious moral foundation. He was a moralist, so-called, but he was very much respecting of Aristotle's primary notions, that people are on the earth to do fine actions. And the problem is if they've got a headache or no shoes on their feet or they're starving to death, they can't be human beings. And a lot of his, I'll just say this in passing, a lot of his existential difficulties or constraints, and a lot of the problem one has if you study Keynes, is to picture these constraints in his life so that you can see what he's saying is not entirely what he's meaning to say. He keeps coming up against walls and he says, okay, since I'm an agent of the British government, there's only certain things I can say in public, right? Or since America is calling itself the most important country, then yes, we have to talk about the dollar and sterling, not sterling and we don't know what comes later. So there are many examples I could give you in Keynes where he comes up against a kind of wall in his existential situation, political or conceptual or background, where he can't say exactly what he wants to say. It just wouldn't be accepted. And I can give you many examples of that. So I wanted to say that just so you have a sense with Keynes also that you go to this kind of so-called poetic place, which is sort of what I mean by this. If you're going to think without controlling the world, you have to be a sort of poet, if you see what I mean. You have to be able to think of everybody and everything at one time, and not only your own interests. So I now want to give another example of this problem. I think it is the problem of reflexivity and how you make it actual in your life as an economist. And it's what Rudolf Steiner called he called it the true price formula. And in his mind, if that formula was operating, all the problems we have in the world, especially like wealth divide problems, simply wouldn't arise. He gives the example that the true price formula he gave in 1922, but the idea of true price he gave in 1905, or he spoke about, and when he said, there is no exploitation in the world of class by class, of group by group. There is only one form of exploitation in the world, economically speaking, and that is when anybody, which in his mind is everybody, doesn't pay the full price for the thing they buy. So if I put that in a very simple example, if I need to sell you something and my cost has been 100 for my mortgage, my family, everything else, and therefore I need to sell it for 110 to have a bit of profit. If you say 100 for cash, and I blink first and say okay, the effect of that will be, because I needed 110, I now have a loss, if I put it in accounting terms. And so I can only continue if the 110 which I've expended is now covered by 100 revenue and 10 borrowed from the bank. I hope you see what I'm meaning. So if I make an image of this, if you need 110 and I give you 100, you're 10 out. And the only way you can do that is put that on your Visa or on your bank or borrow the money from your parents and keep going. You can't stop eating or you can't stop incurring your costs. So every time anybody anywhere doesn't pay the true price, as Steiner called it, you force that person into debt if the price you pay is less than the true price. And so in his example, he then says, or he implies, if you imagine everyone is doing that permanently throughout the world for 200 years, don't be surprised if there's no money in the world, it's all capital and there's no income. Because you are systematically removing the income from the world and replacing it with borrowings. So that will result in a world entirely in debt with the world we live in today. A world which has structurally not enough income for the people on the planet. So this is a very powerful notion. That he says in 1905, and anything else as far as he's concerned is a kind of a waste of time to go anywhere else. You are, by this process, indebting the whole world, and in the end we'll have to go to Mars to get the money. And it's one of life's little interesting things. If you fly around the world, everybody's looking for inward investment, or they're all hoping the bank in some other country is going to bail them out. This makes sense if you stay in your country. But if you get on a plane and you fly around the world, when you come back home, you think, so where was that inward investment coming from? If you de-domicile yourself by going on a world trip or by operating in the financial markets, the foreign exchange markets, which is what you do, you never in the foreign exchange markets, you never have a domestic domicile. Right? You're dead in those markets if you wed to your country, to your currency. You have somehow to find a place which is like this or like this. Otherwise, you can't function in those markets. So it's the same story all the time. And now I want to just give you the way that Steiner then, 17 years later, formulates that, because for an economist, I think, as a history of economic thought, it's very interesting. And I'll just say it very simply. The way he voices it is, a true price is forthcoming when a person receives as counter value for what he has produced, sufficient to enable him to satisfy the whole of his needs until he will again have completed a like product. If I put that very simply, if you're going to sell something, let's say I'm a producer of something, doesn't matter what, if I'm going to sell this, I need enough money to cover my expenses until I can produce another one. It's a bit of a no-brainer, actually, or I'm going out of business. So if I'm a village baker, the reason I need an income stream is so I can produce bread tomorrow, not to cover the costs of yesterday. And so this formula is very simple, but it means the whole focus is on the future. It has no relationship to the past. And for Steiner, this is a formula. He actually says it's like Pythagoras' theorem. It's inexhaustive. It's comprehensive. And if you think about that as an economist, it is very powerful stuff, because it says any producer, whether you're producing a good, strictly speaking, whatever value you're producing, whether it's a physical value or an idea, you need to have enough income that you can reproduce it. That's very complicated, because that means there's no reference to the past in this. So all your pricing is coming out of tomorrow. It's not really complicated to understand, because if you're in business and you realize you sold your bread too cheaply, your problem is you're going to have a liquidity problem, but you've got tomorrow to double the price. If you fail to double your price, then you're going to have a problem. And often it's the case in business when people wrongly price things that they should have just, So they usually have a liquidity problem, which the bank takes advantage of I'm never nice to banks. And the actual problem is they just need to hang in there until they can get their price where it needs to be and recuperate the losses of the day before. So in business and in economics, you are always working with tomorrow and never with yesterday. I think that's just a fact. So I say that because when you come into this whole world, whatever happened in the past is totally irrelevant. The only thing that matters is what's coming in the future. And this, again, I would say I think is endemic or axiomatic for Steiner, but I think it was also axiomatic for Keynes. He was only trying to read what's coming. His problem was his language was belonging to the past. But I'm quite sure, as an economist, the most important economist of our times, really, he was just trying to read what is coming towards us. But he was constrained by the situations he found himself in. And if you read Keynes, it's really important, I think, to make this distinction all the time. Is what he's trying to say caught in what he said, or only half expressed? And where would he go if he could move on? So I'm going to pause there, I think, because you may not think I've said much about Steiner, but I very deliberately kept it totally focused on this notion. Because I think if we don't see that the world has a problem in its development, and it's not going to be solved by any one person, not even a Keynes, certainly not a Friedman. No one economist is going to crack this nut. We have to solve this nut collectively. How do we think reflexively and how do we behave reflexively? That has huge implications, both institutional, if you like. Would there be a World Bank? And if so, what would it be doing? Where would it be? Who would run it? Would there be an IMF? And does it always have to have a French person at the top of it? By what rule do we have this going on, right? But that's a kind of convention. But by what objective criteria do we always have to have a French person in charge of the IMF? It's just a deal the Americans did with the French, more or less. Okay, you get that one, we get this one. But that's not exactly economic, is it? It's very clearly political. But you come into these questions. Who would actually be running the central organ of liquidity in the world, the IMF? Does that have to be a French person? I could give you many examples. And all these what I call institutional problems, they cannot be solved unless you solve the epistemological problem. And then it becomes chicken egg. Who moves first? And just to end, I think the contribution of Steiner, as also the contribution of Keynes, and at some point I think they could be shown to. You can look at Keynes through the eyes of Steiner, and then you would start to rewrite Keynes. So one thing I'm actually doing is I'm rewriting the general theory, but by looking at it through Steiner's eyes, and I'm just rewriting that book. And it just it's very interesting. There's not a lot that in fact has to change. I just say this in passing. It's a very interesting exercise. What would Keynes have to say? And recently, for example, with the 2008 crisis, Keynes' official biographer, or for most people his official biographer, Lord Skidelsky, who wrote this 3-volume biography of Keynes, the best one, in my opinion. With the 2008 crisis, he rushed out a book called The Return of the Master, in which he purported, or that the idea of the book was, he, as his official biographer, who'd written these very extensive books, and therefore really engaged in his whole life, and in fact, in Skidelsky's case, he had leased, when Keynes lived in Sussex with his wife, the Russian ballerina, he leased a farmhouse in Sussex, which is still there. And Skidelsky, when I first met Skidelsky, he was the leaseholder of Keynes' house. So he actually moved into Keynes' house. This is not totally anecdotal. And so there he lived in Keynes' space. And therefore he has a very strong connection. And so then he wrote this book in which he purports to speak as if he were Keynes. It's not quite how he says it, but kind of that's the thesis of this book, The Return of the Master, and what would the master say about the 2008 crisis? It's a very interesting book. And so I wanted to kind of speak in this way to kind of get a sense, well, what will Keynes say about this problem? What would Steiner say about this problem? And are they so different? And then if that were the case, or if that was in the debate, what would happen, from my point of view, all around the world to the debates? So in this case here, I'm going to stop. If you accepted this thesis of mine, what would be the consequence for you in your situation? I mean in this institute, but I also mean in Brazil, for you as Brazilians. Does it have the consequence, which I hope it would have, that especially if we adopt the institutional suggestions of Keynes, the International Clearing Union, for example, if we adopt these things, where would the hegemon be? And if there's no hegemon, how does the whole world hang together? My idea is somehow you have to think reflexively, but also it means every country has to respect every other country and not see it as a potential market to dominate or to gang up with against the other markets. All that kind of stuff has to stop. But where would that put a country like Brazil? So I'm going to stop there. It may have been patchy, but I've done that deliberately because I would like to now have a, not Q&A, but a conversation and see where this goes. Yeah. It's okay?
But, can't you talk a little bit about the crisis and how you can interpret it?
I can talk about the crisis, but the way I would talk about that is by reference to this book. Just because if you want the detail, you find it in this book. And because this book was, for me, it was an interesting event where I was in Australia in 2008, and someone sent me an email saying, can you please comment on this chapter? This is an economist in England. He was then the head of Buckingham University Business School, and I'd known him to correspond with many years before, and what it was a chapter in a book he was writing, and the chapter was about me. And I wrote back to him saying, why am I in a book about economics? You know, nobody knows me, I don't exist really. And he said, because unknown to you, I think you're important. So I said, okay, right away. And then we met in London to just understand this. And out of this meeting, he said, okay, I'm a commissioning editor for Gower, which is the publisher here, and I would like to commission you to write a book about the financial crisis through the eyes of an Englishman, using the lens of Rudolf Steiner. That means through the eyes of an Englishman, London, not Chicago. Because there's a subtle difference between the English and the Americans. We introduce little ideas into the world, and we make it look like the Americans did. So if there's any problems, the American get the rap, right? That's our little trick, right? So we have the nice, innocent little ideas. We let the Americans get very noisy and go down to Chile and reconstruct Chile in the name of Chicago and so on. And if anything blows up, that was the Americans who did that, not our little idea of privatization and so on. That's how we operate, right? And it's not just a joke, don't think. So I was asked to write through the eyes of an Englishman, but my target audience was very important. These were concerned practitioners, meaning people in markets and in central banks who have questions about what's happening, as opposed to those who really don't care, right? They're just planning to exit or to retire before the pension markets crash, right? Or to get this Ferrari before they burn out. There are a lot of people like that in finance, right? But there are so-called concerned practitioners who don't think like that. There are very few of them, but that's one market. And the other market were economists who are trained economists from Cambridge or wherever, but they are in-house in central banks and in financial houses. They're not in a place like this, so to speak, teaching They might be teaching in the morning, but in the afternoon they quickly go off down to the City of London and earn some real money, having some real fun. So that was the market. And that introduced this strange guy, Rudolf Steiner, into the center of City of London, in fact, because those are my colleagues. And to make it very simple, so the way this book was written is, so what does the world financial, what does the financial community think is going on? And it was very simple, and for me it's very simple. They saw the problem as a problem of excess liquidity in the world. And so I said, okay, well, I think that is the case, but if you say so, I'll let you say so. That's like saying there's too much capital in the world. That's like saying there's too much debt, like there's not enough income. And I would say, well, that's exactly what you get if you don't have true prices. So now we're in 2008, we've hit a wall. And it's very important because in the literature, if you talk about financial crises, until 2008, you never spoke about a global financial crisis, not in the literature. You might talk about international financial crises, but the language was, you would have a financial crisis in Argentina, and this has to be quarantined. Or in Russia, and this has to be quarantined. Like you can stop rabies coming across to England through the English Channel, or so, I don't know. The idea was you have a physical idea we can quarantine the financial markets in Argentina. Good luck, it's just nonsense, right? You can do tricks, right? And you can bankrupt Thailand, this you can do, and bargain basement all the companies in Thailand and let all the Thai people jump out of skyscrapers and kill themselves. This you can do, but this isn't quarantining the financial situation. So the language was, we never talk about a global financial crisis. And so when the global financial crisis was so called, you can bet your bottom dollar we're in another situation. The world has now gone global, and it cannot be quarantined. And this has huge consequences, which I then deal with in here. The first one is epistemological. So it's just, how do we understand this world? Because in the end of the early 20th century, it took the form of no gold standard, no fixed point. But when you come to 2008, we're back where we were before, and now we're back with exactly the same problem. But this isn't operating, so unless we get here, where are we going? There is no solution. And the only way that problem was solved, technically or practically, was we pump out billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars, kick the can down the street, and hope we don't get a recession which becomes permanent. That's a forlorn hope, if you look at the world today. We're in a recession which has gone permanent, but we just haven't got the courage to say so. And we're pumping out enormous amounts of money which will never be repaid back, and the world is sub-militarized already. So you will find here, I know you will find here, there are water cannon all around Brazil waiting to quieten down anyone who gets together on the street and has a problem with your policies. I'm trying to be very simplistic, but that's the case all around the world. Even in England, where the chiefs of police recently asked permission to buy water cannon because the austerity measures are such that the English police forces expect riots in the street, and we've never been allowed to have water cannon in England before. So that's the kind of world situation. The whole world is now full of water cannon to hose down the people who can't afford to live. It's a bit extreme, but that's what's going on. And you already see it here in Brazil. We see it on the TV. So that's not to make a dramatic story. It's just to describe the world is without income, is full of debt, and now all this debt has been replaced by government pumped out money, as far as I understand it. And so the question I say in here is, if we don't want to go down that path, first we have to think in terms of reflexivity. We have to be able to think it. Second, we have to review all the institutions of the world. And thirdly and fourthly, we have to find a foundation for economics once it's gone global, which is already global, has always been universal, and can only ever be universal, and can never be captured by any ideology or any country. And that, putting it very quickly, is double-entry bookkeeping. Once you come to double-entry bookkeeping, you have complete solid ground under your feet. And it's always a challenge for economists. It's me speaking, can economists match in their way the implicit economics of double-entry bookkeeping. I'm only just saying this, and all that follows out of the inherent nature of accounting on which all economic life in fact depends. You can describe a business in economic terms, whichever terms you want. You can analyze it from all sorts of points of view, but basically what you're describing and analyzing is a company which makes a profit on operating and increases own capital, which it shares with the rest of the world, or part of it. This is what you're looking at. You can describe that in all sorts of ways, but the thing you cannot get around is the whole economic life is grounded on double-entry bookkeeping. And this cannot be captured. There's no such thing as left-wing double-entry bookkeeping or right-wing double-entry bookkeeping. And even the most Marxist organization and the most Friedmanite organization, they come to the same place when they do their accounts. There's no escape. It's kind of no man's land. So that's what this goes into. And the last thing is the consequence of this is now the main problem that many governments said is, well, how are we not going to have another 2008 crisis? And they all say, that's easy. We're going to teach all the young people in high school to be financially literate. And I say, and my colleagues, well, yeah, depends on what you teach them. If you teach them the financial literacy that caused the 2008 crisis, how's that going to help? That's just going to make it worse. So we have to review everything top to bottom. How do we understand finance? And now we have to review this and now teach this and make it mandatory in all high schools worldwide. What's actually happening is it is becoming mandatory in high schools worldwide, but this is a great growth thing for American Express, who are very quick to put their financial literacy programs into the high school system. And they are often linked to the textbook manufacturers. I don't know how it is in Brazil, but if in England, if you get a textbook, you see, well, that's interesting. The publisher of the textbook is the same company through its subsidiaries that examines economists. And you wonder, oh, interesting. Okay. So Pearson, they publish all the economics textbooks for high school, and Pearson runs the company which controls the examination board because the government gave it to Pearson under contract. Well, that looks like a conflict of interest to me. Certainly they're not going to say there's something in the textbook which isn't in the exam, and so on. And this is the reality of it. So what financial literacy are you going to teach? Are you going to teach the normal stuff, or what are you going to teach? Because if it's just everything which led to the 2008 crisis, you're just going to make it endemic. But if now you can rethink this whole thing quite neutrally, now you have a chance, if every young person leaves high school financially literate, understanding how money is created, how credit is created, and so on, and able to manage their own affairs, you will have a different, a totally different situation. And if I end with a very simple example, in the realm of central banking. Central banking has got to the point where it used to be able to speak. It used to control the economy through all sorts of techniques and levers. And then, in England anyway, we got to the point where we stopped speaking and we just send out signals. A signal could be, I'm the head of the central bank and I cough at 5 minutes to 12 when I'm not supposed to cough. I don't know if you know what I mean. So if Alan Greenspan was to do this, at 5 minutes to 12 on TV, that would send a signal to the market. He's not sure what he's doing. That's all he needs to do, right? And he can cause chaos in the markets because we're all in the realm of expectations. And who knows who's thinking what. And what Soros says, it's wonderful what he says, if you can't live in this world, get out of it, right? He's very straightforward. If you can't live in this world, and he says, in that world, just to think a price is to change the price. And if you don't understand that, he says, exit the market and take all your money with you. You shouldn't be in that world. It's very interesting. And in that world, once you get to the point of signaling, like you shouldn't have inflation in the Brazilian economy or the English economy, now you become dependent on the actors do not inflate the economy. You can have systems where you prevent them inflating it, monetary policy and so on, but you can also, when you get to this point, if I understand I am not to act in an inflationary manner and I stop acting in an inflationary manner, hey presto, there will be price stability and the central banks can just go home. And I'm being fairly descriptive to avoid too much of a technical problem. But that's, I think, the situation. It's a very moot point today whether central banks do what they say they do. I think it's an extremely moot point. I don't want to get too much into this because I don't know what you teach here about central banking techniques. But in the world that I'm describing and the world I'm involved in professionally, it is about that. I'll end with a particular project in Europe. We've just begun a 4-year project, and the core concept is open access credit, meaning when a young person who is financially literate says they need $10,000, you issue them $10,000. You don't say, there's only so much money in the world, what will happen if you go bankrupt, or all this kind of stuff. You just make the issue of the credit dependent on their success and on nothing else. And you reverse the markets. That's just to give you a sign of, I think, once you go beyond the crisis, if you think like this is totally different to pumping out money from the central bank in the hope the problem will solve itself. And I can end that with a very simple example. Where you have, let's say, 45% youth unemployment in Spain, and it's not the only country, they don't have a job. And I say, no, but tell me what you want to do. And tell me how much capital you need. If you get that capital, now you've got a job. So your problem is access to credit, not access to the job market. And if you just have an image, the increasing unemployment around the world, technological unemployment especially, can't be solved by the job market. It will only be solved by giving young people access to credit. They will then do what they want to do with their lives. I always say, if you follow what you want to do in life, you will always have a job. If you have a job, you may never find what you want to do in life. And I'm very certain about this. So that's kind of where the whole thing comes to a culmination. And in terms of post-2008, I think I'm very serious about this. A policy of this kind, you can then rebuild the whole world economy, because the image is now everybody is financially literate, not just the institutions. And so the institutions will reflect this financial literacy. The problem will always be, how do we stand in this reflexive world? How do we think in this way? How do we organize ourselves? And to end, what is the consequence for economics? One of the main casualties, I'm not an economist, so I'm very innocent in all this, but one of the main casualties, it's said, of the economic crisis, the global economic crisis, it proves economists are not needed. And they're struggling to give themselves a new foundation. So you have Soros with his new economic thinking stuff and all these, the World Economists Association, 7,000 economists signed up, whatever's going on. But the problem is the profession lost its foundation. Because, as the Queen of England said, because they didn't see it coming. And they are the scientists in this world. So that's me speaking about economists as a historian. So I'm not in that problem. But I think as an historian, it is the essential problem. On what ground does economics now stand? What happens to all its theories, how do we manage this problem? Yeah.
Todo mundo entendeu, ele quer, né, que ele diz assim, cada país tem a sua concepção, a gente não deveria ficar tratando tudo uma mesma moeda, né? Então, não é só questão de trocas, é tudo. É a concepção do mundo, é a forma de ver, né? Por isso que ele quer ter um pouco aqui da gente, do Brasil, como é que é tudo isso. Um pouco disso vem para as perguntas e outro... Certo, Xavier? Mais alguma coisa que você tem para dizer? Diga.
Estou querendo escutar o pessoal aqui. Tem muita coisa falando ali, né?
Se ajuda a traduzir como é que ele vê a UNICAMP e o sistema financeiro internacional.
Para onde ele acha que deveria ir?
Onde ele acha que vai.
O que vai?
O que vai acontecer com o sistema financeiro nessa área?
Porque tem, vamos dizer assim, é uma boa opção. Faz as duas, as duas perguntas.
He was asking, how do you think the financial system is going? And maybe the other question would be, should be going.
A way I describe that is that if you look historically, I could perhaps just draw this, just so you have an image. And this is where economic historians have the advantage over economists. We're always in the process of time. We're not trapped in a moment of time, we say. So we observe the history of economic thought, the history of economic development, and particularly the history of finance. And you can see, if I make a very simple image, that over time, nowadays we're very conscious of what we're doing, financially speaking, as a generality. But if you go back in time, only elders knew what was going on, only the gods ran things, only the kings looked after the money, if you see what I mean. There was the kind of thing historically where you could say that we're on a path where up here, only God, if you look at ancient money, it's always got a god on it. And then you come to the king or the pharaoh, whoever it might be. And it's only in recent times that you could say the ordinary individual can understand finance and even have money. There are even people in here who don't have addresses, so they can't have bank accounts. So it's fairly recent that as a generality, ordinary human beings can understand finance. And if you track that process over time, you can see that at a certain point, and I would make it the Renaissance, you have bancos. So you have the appearance of independent banks, the Medici, the Fugas, these banks from the Middle Ages. And then if you come to a time, let's say, when things shifted from Amsterdam to London, so let's say 1694, the Bank of England, then here you have lots of independent banks, but when you come to this point, there's something that's coming about that you can call the banking system, the relationship between the banks. This deals with fractional reserve lending and all these things. So when independent banks start to trade with each other or deal with each other, now you're getting a system of banks. And then fractional reserve lending, for example, can begin, not before. And this lasts for quite a long time, where you go from the bancos to the banking system, which is how most people describe it today, even today. And I would say that's anachronistic, certainly since 2008. And now we have a kind of process. So we talk about as banking system or financial system, but actually we should be talking about a financial process. In a system, you expect an organization to be at the center of it, like a central bank. In a process, you need to understand what's going on. And the main problem, I think, between 2008 and now is the locus of that we were in a process and not a system. And the locus of understanding of this was with the experts, or with the central bankers, who were enacting their image of how the financial system worked. But it's their image, and they have the right to enact their image. So if you think a central bank is the issuer of money, and you're Bernanke, you have an image plus the power to enact your image. And then it will look like the Fed issues money, to make it simple. But the question is, if you're in a process, where does the locus of thinking go? And on this side, the locus would be in the center. But if you go further, every person who understands the financial, not just the system, but the process, becomes the locus of operating. So and before here, I would say, I'm depending on the central bank or the banking system to create credit. But after here, I say, no, if I need capital for something, as long as I don't screw up, the capital is created by me needing it. The bank lends it at this point in time, it seems. But the bank must say, well, we're not lending it unless you've got something you want to do with it. So in fact, we're now in this world I was saying before, we're not really in a system, we're in a process. We still think the locus of understanding and operating of this is somehow in the center, with the authorities or with the central bank governor or whoever we deem to be in the center, but not me. But if everyone becomes financially literate, they would just start to trade with each other as an image, and then a kind of space will appear here, which none of them occupy. That's another version of it's the same as this. So if everybody was financially literate, what otherwise will become a world central bank becomes unnecessary. So that's why in everything I'm now involved in, this book ends up saying, unless we ground economics on accounting, and unless we teach young people this new economics, we have no solution. All we're going to do is pump out money and militarize the world and keep the lid on everything while people starve to death. That's the 21st century. Unless we do something like this, but then there are consequences. The locus of understanding and managing the world economy goes with all the individuals on it. Right? And the fact that they're Americans or British or Brazilian counts for nothing if they want to use this to dominate the rest of us. It counts for enormous if you say the light of London is liquidity, but the light of Brazil is the dance. You know, I would say, as a kind of stupid expression, nobody can do liquidity like the British, and nobody can dance like the Brazilians, least of all the British. Huh?
No, nobody can do what?
Nobody can do liquidity like the British, and nobody can dance like the Brazilians, least of all the British, right? Yeah, because if in every country you can find what is its, what's its real identity, this is what you build an economy on, not copying what the British did in the 18th century. This is not, industrializing everything. This will never happen anymore. But you have to find what can this country bring to the table that no other country can bring to the table. And I think this is a real thought. And you kind of mustn't copy it. You mustn't do Brazilian dancing cheaper, right? You just, this is Ricardo's comparative advantage taken to some scaled up, right? If you can't do the samba in London, just don't do it, right? Just manage liquidity and let the Brazilians do the samba. Well, I don't know what I'm talking about, but, right? We have to get a little bit away from the fact that once I see what the samba is, I think I can do the samba. No. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
If I may, you don't say that in this world you don't have central banks, but the role of the central bank changes, no?
I think, what would happen in this world, and it's already the case, in fact, if you look at any bank or banking system or the bank or the central bank, you have two things going on. It's basically a huge bookkeeping exercise done on your behalf. If you, I assume you've all got bank accounts, otherwise it doesn't work. But if you have a bank account, and now you go through the month and you're buying and selling things through the bank account, you have your record of your income and expense, and then at the end of the month you get your bank statement, which is just a mirror image of what you already know. Yeah? So in that sense, you can let the bank do your bookkeeping for you. And that's essentially what banks do. They're just doing the bookkeeping worldwide on the one and only way you can do it on double entry. But if you now imagine you've trusted your bookkeeping not to a bank but to a bookkeeper, if he then says, this is your accounts for the month, and I noticed during that month you had $1 million in your deposit account, but I took it out and played the markets in Monte Carlo and put it back in again, you would have a problem with your accountant, right? He's not allowed to touch the money he's keeping the accounts for. Not in my mind, anyway. So if you make that image, you hire a guy to do your bookkeeping, and he notices, this is what happened to Elton John and Leonard Cohen and all these people. They entrust their money to some professional who then says, oh, it's a lot of money in his account. I'll just use a little bit and put it back without him realizing. This goes on all the time. Well, if you found your accountant was doing that, you'd say, that's not the deal. You're keeping my books, not touching my money. I think that's clear, no? Now, if you're a bank, what's going on with banks is, as well as doing the bookkeeping, they take hold of the money flows. And with these money flows, they work the markets. That is the problem. So in this situation, all that would happen technically, and banks, if they have any sense of what's going on in history, all they know what they have to do. They have to stop touching the money flows and just do the bookkeeping. Charge a fee for that service, because it's a very important service, but they don't need to touch the money flows in order to do bookkeeping. And that is the problem they have. If they can't make this distinction, they will go out of business, because we don't need that anymore. And if they were wise about how they would strategize, they would make the image, okay, our service is we do bookkeeping for a fee, and the money just flows through us as a means of doing bookkeeping, but we don't touch it. This has enormous consequences, but it doesn't mean there is no banking in the future. It just means the central bank becomes the reciprocal point. It just shows you where the whole economy is struck off. The moment of price stability, which otherwise it's trying to engineer through all its techniques, where in fact it should just be seeing, oh, everyone knows how to work the economy to the effect of price stability. I think it's really as simple as that, and it becomes a question. So once one understands this, so how do we very carefully, without shaking the whole thing apart, how do we shift, conceptually maybe, but institutionally, by policy and so on, how do we shift into that world? Because if we don't, we're just going to start shaking the machine will just start shaking. Yeah. I think. You see that the financial system is incredibly unstable, in fact.
Let me try to see if I understand well all of you're saying. On one hand, I have the impression that using this old model in Brazil, we were able to stop inflation in 1995 with the Plano Real. And it was a very, I would say, psychological issue. You know, one moment we said we are fed up of all this inflation, so let's stop with it. And at the same time, we managed some accounts that were, let's say, pouring money into the economy. So at that point, I don't know. When I look at the political, at the policies that are being set up now in Brazil to control inflation, so we went from, we are only using monetary policy. We went from, I don't know, it was 13% interest rate, it went down until 7 something, and I was getting back to 12%. So for me it's clear that's useless, the policy that we are adopting now. But is this something that we would say that in Brazil, intuitively I understand what you're saying. I just can't see how intuitively, and also because I think that we have to think economics not as science thinks scientific issues, with one causing the other. We have to think systemically. The only way is to think systemically, and we are not used to thinking You have still to understand, learn how to think systemically. So at that point I understand. I also understand clearly with you that the way we are doing the policies now all over the world, this is not going to be, this is no way of doing it. But still, you know, I have no clear vision of if we can generalize that. So that's why I wanted to see a bit better this relationship between what you are saying of the true price and the crisis. So what you are saying is that as the excess of liquidity that exists is related to the lack of using the true price. And so how, and doing good bookkeeping, we would be closer to true prices. And from there, we would be possible to have a world with no economic problems.
Okay, let me just try and illustrate my answer.
Okay.
Because I don't know what you generally in the room know about accounting, so I'll make an image of what I understand by it. And if you have, I'll do it this way. If you start a business from an accounting point of view, you have a day one balance sheet, and you say you're going to be an institute of economics, I mean as a business, right? And therefore you need a building, you need equipment, or whatever you need. You build up your active side of your balance sheet, and then you say we're going to have to buy these at the market rate, and now you have the passive side. This is your active, your passive, and that will be made up of debt, I do it in English, and equity. I don't know if you do that kind of stuff here, but that's conventional way of understanding a balance sheet. You have active or assets in English, passive, and passive is simply the way you finance your assets on day one, right? And those values will be the price you have to pay to buy the chairs. The minute you've bought them, they've gone down in price, right? So your starting balance sheet is always given to you by your assets, and those are always a function of what you're going to do. So if I'm going to teach a class of 60 people, I need 60 chairs. So just as my passive side is given to me by my active is given to me by what am I going to do with these assets. That's how you start always. And then you start trading here. And equity, you can call it fondo proprio, own capital. Huh?
Capital proprio.
Capital proprio is the language, own capital. And so you have, let's say, 100 income, less 90, and you have 10 lucro. And now that you adjust your balance sheet, it's going to go black now. So let's say this comes to 1,000, and I have no debt, and I have 1,000 fondo proprio as I start, and now I trade successfully. Now I have 1,000 plus 10, and strictly speaking, let's say this is worth 900 and this is worth 100. Now, infinitesimally, I've used up a little bit of building. So strictly speaking, that would depreciate it down to 850. And more obviously, these chairs have been used up, so they're worth 90. Okay? So as I use them, they go down in value. Now I have a profit which is increasing my capital. And at this point in the example, if this is 940 and now I have 1,100 here, I've now got 160 cash. I'm just trying to give a simple example that if I now assume that in here all this has been amortized and depreciated, okay? The point I'm trying to show is as you trade profitably, so you internally generate the capital you got from outside. But the principle on day one still holds. The amount of the assets on your active side are only a function of what you're doing. And that tells you the size of your passive balance sheet in accounting terms. In juridical terms, it's different because now you start having an amount of capital in here which belongs to the entity but is not needed by the entity. So you start putting it in the markets, right? Do you understand what I'm trying to say? So the way you can understand that is, one way would be you could organize that whenever you get more capital than you need, you simply get rid of it. You give it to another company or you spend it away. But if you maintain this capital, then your best thing to do is imagine you have other business inside your entity. And in fact, what we do when we put our excess in the markets, we're just running it through the banking system, putting it in someone else's business. That's all we're doing. So you could make that, you can make your, if you were analyzing it, I would look at your balance sheet and I'd say, what of your balance sheet is really needed by what you're doing? And what of it is like a second business that you're running through your excess capital? It's not a moral position, it's technical. You've got more capital in here than is needed, so you put it in the markets. And if you're not to misread your balance sheet, you need to make this exercise very clear, because this is at huge risk. This is at the risk of, is this building here, is it in good shape? But this money is out in the markets, and anything could happen to that. So one needs on the level of accounting to make some kind of image that when we overcapitalize a balance sheet, part of that capital is not needed by this business, and implicitly it's in another business somewhere, which I can't see. Because that's behind the financial market somewhere. And it may not be a problem, but you have to go find this business. So if I was doing a tax investigation and I want to see, do they actually own a building like this? I'd come and look at it without you knowing. And I say, okay, that's true. But if you say this is in some business in Hong Kong, I'm going to go and have to find it, and that's not going to be so easy because it's hidden in the markets. So that's just on one level. If you come from the so-called micro end, you do have a way of tracking what I'm meaning, but you can also track it very, very methodically, so long as you understand the balance sheet is a function of the activity and the financing is a function of that. You have another problem today because, of course, you can play the markets. So once you've invest the primary capital in the form of shares for the stock market, for example, or you buy bonds, right? As well as all this, I can work your balance sheet from outside. Yeah? I can say, you know, it looks like he made money, but in my opinion, he didn't. And I can ruin your shares because I want to buy them at the bottom and sell them at the top. So you have all this kind of reversed use of balance sheets going on, which is a particularly strong phenomenon since the beginning of the 19th century. Since we lost the gold standard, all this stuff is now possible. That the normal understanding we have also of accounting is from inside out, and we really don't understand in a reflexive economy, I can now work your balance sheet from outside. You might be ever so profitable, but I only need to badmouth you in the markets, and the shareholders say, what? And they pull their shares, and I will crash your company. And I can do this because I want to buy your company. So this we all know, right? So that becomes very complicated. But I hope you have a sense from inside outwards through accounting, we could manage this if we start to show up, create our shadow activities. And then we can start to track these. These are just behind the markets. And maybe the markets are, the problem we will actually have is maybe the markets are overcapitalized. I don't think they are. The problem is if you try and ground the amount of capital in the world on the real economy, there's way too much capital in the world. It doesn't mean it shouldn't be there. The problem will be, is the counterpart of that capital to be found in the real economy or in some new economy, you know, when I invent a little thing to go inside the Mac, right? Is that really there, that little thing? Because all the value I'm generating is not the same as a chair. You know, it's like a Mozart symphony. He's way out of copyright, right? But you can sell Mozart to the end of the earth, and the consumer is always the beneficiary, never the producer type stories. And that is the economy we're in primarily. The producer gets hardly any of the productivity gains. This is technological unemployment. Every time you tweak a computer or a cab or whatever it might be, you're putting people out of business. So these are the kind of problems. And so that's on one side. If I do it from a monetary policy point of view, I think it's, the way I try and describe it is like this. If you are in Brazil here, and you're the central bank of Brazil, okay? You have two instruments, more or less. You can control your monetary policy domestically. That's one thing you have to manage. What's the rate of inflation in this country? And you can get yourself all organized so there will be price stability, meaning you can introduce policies that are effective, preferably not by imposition, but because they correspond to the way the country is, so that you achieve price stability inside your jurisdiction. And that might have taken you, let's say, I don't know, 5 years to achieve, or 10 or something. And then along come the financial markets, so this is your foreign exchange rate, and they can wipe you out in a second. And this is always the problem. Inside a central bank, so long as I'm a central bank, I have jurisdiction in my economy, and then I can enact central bank independence, monetary policy in the normal way, or the normal way today. But it's only operating in a world in which I have jurisdiction, in which my laws operate. It's my money. This is the real. It's not the dollar we're talking about. So all that is very important. This is legal tender. And now along comes George Soros, who thinks he's going to come into Brazil for 5 minutes and then go back to the yen, right? And overnight, he can wipe all this out. And so this is what I understand by Milton Friedman. He may not have meant this. This is what I think he meant. If you accept this paradigm of an independent central bank, which controls domestic monetary policy, you still have the issues of what would the policies be which correspond with the reality of the country. So I don't mean you just impose zero inflation on a country which is not going to get there. That you can't just say zero inflation is a virtue for everybody, which is the problem with central bank independence. You should say more, what is the inflation rate that corresponds with the people of the country we're talking about? Then you'd be in a different place. Maybe between 7 and 12 is the inflation rate belongs to Brazil. It's only the English who say it should be zero. But one of the things you see, when through all this technology, all this procedure, when we started out in the 80s to bring about zero inflation worldwide, we didn't see, at least I don't think anyone saw, this will just flatten the economy. And once everyone's on zero inflation, the foreign exchange markets can't work because they depend on differential inflation rates. And this is a serious problem, I think. I don't know whether people saw this or they just, so I'm assuming nobody saw it. So they pushed central bank independence worldwide and didn't realize this would take everything down to zero, and then the foreign exchange market can't operate. So now they're busy trying to create an inflation differential around the world against their theoretical position. So it would have been easier to say, yes, we have monetary policy, but the inflation rate will be a function of the people in that country, not some English notion in a five-star air-conditioned building downtown in Sao Paulo, right, full of people from IMF or whatever, right? And then you can start to see, I think, from this drawing, what Friedman is saying. If everybody, I don't know if this is going to work conceptually. Now I go to Argentina, which is I don't want to start a war, but let's go to Argentina, right? And let's imagine that Cristina lets the central bank free again, because she got rid of Martin a few years ago. But let's imagine we get back on track, and they have an independent central bank in Argentina, which also runs monetary policy in Argentina. That would take some doing to get the Argentine people to behave in a non-inflationary manner, or at least in a low inflationary manner. But I think it's doable. So you get the same thing going. But now, for them, this is their... So on this side, they're covered. But on this flank, they're not covered. Because he's about to export all his problems into me through the exchange rate. See what I'm trying to say? So if we go around the world like this, we will end up with every country has a central bank. Everyone is running monetary policy according to their own light. And that will remove, in fact, well, technically that means every country has to float against every currency has to float against every other currency, or this theorem cannot operate. So my doctorate was actually about that, and that's what this book talks about as well. We will never get out of this problem unless universally we apply monetary policy, but not only to 0%. This has to reflect the people of the country. And one can ask what that means, in fact, but I'm just saying it will create an inflation differential. But the process of this will be that it will only be possible if every currency floats universally. That means you can't have dirty floating. You can't have the pegging of Bretton Woods. You can't even have everyone except Korea in the game, speaking economically. It means, it's a huge image. It means that every single country in the world, bar none, is doing this, and their currencies, which are independent currencies, are all floating. And now you come to a huge problem. Well, it's not so huge. So which currency is then running the world? Right? Because you can't go back and say, actually, my currency is the big guy. And now you come to this very interesting thesis, I think, that if you did this, you could have here this could be the pound, this could be the dollar, this could be euro, this could be the, how do you do it? Do you have, let's do it like this, right? You have one of these now. Why do you have one of these? Why don't, find your own, right? And, so you go around the world, the yen is no more interesting, we're interested in the yuan, and I don't know, we can go on forever, right? What is the real one is a good question. And you could have all these domestic currencies still operating, but in this world they would all have to use the same set of accounts, which is the international set of accounting standards. So in this world I'm describing, that's in this book also, the way you come into this world is you replace a national currency as the world currency with a world currency which is just accounting standards. And that's technically where we are today. So if every country were to adopt international accounting standards, right, which simply means when I look around the world investing my money, if on your balance sheet you have liquid investments at the top and illiquid ones at the bottom, that needs to be agreed for everybody. So when I switch to a set of accounts in Japan to a set of accounts in Sweden, I don't want to suddenly find you meant illiquid is at the top and liquid is at the bottom, because I can't see that in a hurry. See what I mean? And that's what the international accounting standards are doing. They're trying to get a situation, when I look at the accounts from any country in the world, I'm seeing one thing. At the moment, this is done from an investment performance point of view. So it's done really from Wall Street perspective. Right?
Using the ratings.
Huh?
Using the ratings.
Using all this stuff, right? But it's, how quickly can I put my money into Japan and get it out again? Right? Well, this I need to just check your balance sheet. And if you call this something else, or if you put this somewhere else, I can't do that. So the international accounting standards are trying to universalize the accounting image so I can move around the world freely and not get caught up in some other culture or some other complication. The main problem with those accounts is they're just driven by the egotism of the investor. And I'll tell you a little story it was Sir David Tweedy when he was the chairman of the International Accounting Standards Board, which is the British one, and he said we got down to a fight between the English and the American. And that got down to a question. The Americans were stupid enough to put a figure on goodwill. Right? And they couldn't, so the question was, I'm putting it fairly simply, do we include goodwill on the balance sheet or not? Right? And he said, that's easy. Yes, we do, but you'll be stupid enough to give it a number. Right? Because you're so, this is an East thing, because you're so into money, right? We're not so stupid, right? When a guy shows me the accounts of a really successful restaurant, because he's a really great chef, and he says, I want to sell my business, I say, no goodwill in that, because the minute you move, your customers are going with you, right? And your balance sheet will tank the minute you leave. No matter how long you've been in business, you know, I can't project that forward, right? Because the minute you leave, your customers are going to go with you. So don't ask me to pay goodwill. You can ask for it, but I'm not paying. Well, it's not that an American would, because I'm being televised. But, in principle, the Americans say, yeah, I'd pay for the goodwill. And he said, with this, we won the game. And then what the English did, because they're English, instead of saying the British standards, they called it the international standards. And the Americans are still with their federal something or other, right? And then, because we're English, then we used our membership of the European Union, with which we're very ambivalent, so that these became law in Europe on the 1st of January 2000, I think. Okay? So this is a huge problem with the United States. So that's how the British work. We call our standards not British, but international, and then we use the European Union to bring them into law, knowing that the European Union is a huge problem for the United States, because that's going to be the United States of Europe eventually. And so what happened on Wall Street was Washington required Wall Street to double account, to report in American terms and to report in international terms. And in the end, I think it was 2008 or 9, March, thereabouts, Wall Street said to Bush, I think it was, we can't go on like this, right? We want to go with the real ones, and the real ones are the international accounting standards. And so they were relieved of the burden of having to report twice. That's how I understand the story. And it's interesting because it's implicit in the whole situation. If we go down this path, and it's very interesting with the financial crisis in I think October 2008, the international accounting standards were kind of, two things happened which are very important. One is short selling was suspended for 6 months. It should have been suspended, not for 6 months. See what I mean? And the other thing was the European Central Bank was not the European Central Bank. In the European Union, certain restraints of the Stability Pact were relaxed. Well, this is like, well, you can't have your cake and eat it. Either we have a Stability Pact and the European Central Bank is politically neutral, or it isn't. So you can't just see when the crunch comes and you have a real test of your political neutrality, you don't abandon this. It's like now with the European Central Bank. One of the huge subsequent consequences of the global financial crisis was the euro crisis, which has been solved. How has it been solved? By breaking the constitution of the European Central Bank, which is not allowed to print money, right? But now it's printing money hand over fist. To hell with all the constitutional stuff we used to say about, you know. So it's what I'm saying is, if you go down this path of serious economic, if you ground it in economics, not politics, and if you link this to accounting, you're involved with an inevitable logic. You have to go where the logic of accounting goes, and it doesn't go to a hegemon. It goes to at least a reciprocal relationship, two hegemons, the two sides of any transaction. And you can't have a transaction in which one party wins and the other loses. This is an illusion. In any transaction, whether it's buying and selling cabbages or foreign exchange swaps, you've got an exchange. In any exchange, both parties profit from the exchange. Otherwise, it wouldn't happen. So if you follow that through, whether you do it through accounting or whether you do it through macroeconomic policy or more monetary policy, really, you come into these kind of situations, which I think are understandable. If we follow the logic of central bank independence into Brazil, whatever the circumstance in 1994, whatever Collor was doing and all this kind of stuff, for me it's not important. What's important is we now have something coming from the future which renders the past irrelevant, strictly speaking. The question is it complete? And it will not be completed until your currency floats against all other currencies, bar none. And then the policy will complete itself. But if you get down this path and that isn't the case, it would just go backwards. It has to, you know. And I can go on for hours about this, so I won't, right? Because you can then get into situations. So between all the central banks, what's going on in the middle? I'm back to my moving point. And at the moment, institutionally anyway, the so-called central bank of central banks, the Bank of International Settlements, which isn't really a central bank, right? It's a kind of clearinghouse. It's where all the central banks who are otherwise in charge of their jurisdiction, to whom do they talk? You know, and I give two very, for me, very important images of this. It's like a captain on a ship. He's a really lonely guy. Right? He's not allowed to talk to his crew, to fraternize. This is forbidden. So who does he talk to? I know this from experience. When I once sailed across the Atlantic, I was the only civilian on this whole ship, and he talked me into the ground because he had problems with his son, right? And he was such a lonely guy on this ship, and he was not allowed to talk to anybody because that fraternizes with the crew, and then you can't control them. So he taught me so I couldn't cope with it any longer. It was a really interesting experience because he was not allowed to talk to anybody else. He could talk to another captain, right? But not to a member of crew. It's like the central banker. He's not allowed to talk to his subjects. And the other, so who does he talk to? He talks to other central bankers in the Bank of International Settlements. But the example I really like to give is in England, because we have a constitutional monarchy, we have the situation where not now well, in a way, the central bank governor reports to the prime minister, strictly speaking. But because we have a constitutional monarchy, how our constitution works is the prime minister is the most important person, powerful person in the country, bar one, which is the monarch. Right? So, and every Tuesday morning, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, or United Kingdom, meets with the monarch and has an unrecorded, unwitnessed conversation every Tuesday without fail since forever. Right? And that we've had, I think we have a monarch who's been on the throne for over 50 years, and she has had maybe 20 prime ministers. So the only continuity we have in our country is all these prime ministers have had to speak to this one person every Tuesday morning, right? And she is not allowed, it's not recorded, there are no witnesses. And in England, the basic deal is the monarch may not comment on the behavior of her government. This is a constitutional crisis in England. So we don't know what the monarch does in these meetings, but if the monarch was to make any public comment, this is a constitutional crisis. Normally we would chop their heads off. And that was a deal we struck 300 years ago. If you stop speaking, you keep your head. This is really the case. And so in our case, it's very interesting. And that means the Prime Minister will say, well, actually, once a week, we have to report to someone. And the magic of all this is, in my understanding, if you imagine now we're all doing this in our national jurisdiction, we all have to report to someone. In my country, it's a constitutional monarchy, so we're all reporting to the monarch, but in England we say, the alchemy is that the kind of responsibility is localized in me, because the monarch has no power. But because she or he has no power, the citizen is responsible. So when Tony Blair took us to war, we all said, not in my name. We didn't vote him out of office. We just said, not in my name. And in my opinion, from then on, he was lamed. He's a dead duck, and he sneaks around in the shadows of the world doing all sorts of deals. But really, he's a dodgy guy, right? I think. And so I think it's interesting, if you do it in a republic, to whom are you recounting if you're the central bank governor? Okay, the president or wherever he is, but how does that relate to the people of the country? And in the same dynamic, you will find, that's what I said before, there's no point in Brasilia you issuing a policy which is to one side of what's really living in Brazil. Yeah? There's no point saying zero inflation just because some British person, who can't dance thinks that's a virtue. You have to sort of say, what's the inflation rate when they're doing a samba? What's the inflation rate when half the economy is unseen behind garages making stuff for the next carnival off the radar? We don't have that in England. Our economy is all on the radar, right? But in Brazil, a huge part of your economy is off the radar, creating the carnival, which is the motor, I don't know, it's kind of the motor of the Brazilian economy when you're not playing on oil and other stuff you do. But if I ask what's the kind of, where's the real equivalent of the people that dance, I start thinking, oh, let's run the numbers on carnival, right? Behind all those doors, right, where there's no record of it, right? But people are still eating, doing stuff, and then you have a big event, and everyone comes from all over the world to see it. That's good cash. Do you see what I mean? So, from a political point of view, that isn't there because that's outside the taxation, right? And maybe they're not using even Brazilian currency, okay? But it's still going on. And if you depoliticize the economy, it has huge ramifications. One is taxation would change, and then nobody would want to be off the radar. I'm saying that very quickly, right? But why am I off the radar? Because someone's going to take a bite out of my apple and then use it on a yacht or whatever they're going to do with it, right? So if you stop doing that, I might release into the economy my trade. But meanwhile, I'm going to do it behind the garage doors. And if I do look at an economy like Brazil, I could say something else if I was in Argentina. Then I see there's a huge, the real economy, the economy which is there on the ground, is much larger than the one that's being reported on and managed by all sorts of policies. You see what I mean? And so you come into this question, so what would actually have to happen in any country, doesn't matter which, so that it's freed up from all this black and white stuff. And last week we had a really interesting discussion in Argentina about black and white money, because it's a real problem in Argentina. And where it went to is, it was interesting because, of course, the white money is the money you report for taxation, and the black money, so-called, is what you don't report for taxation. And I said, well, actually, it's not really true. The white money is the money which is subject to the national jurisdiction. And the black money, from the point of view of your nation, is the money of the rest of the world. So in the case of Argentina, they have their Argentine peso, which is controlled by their central bank and taxed by their president and all this kind of stuff. But the black economy is done in US dollars, which is the world's currency. So if you see what I'm getting at, from within inside any national jurisdiction, the white money is the money controlled by your country. The black money is the real money, because that's the money working in the world economy without any jurisdiction. I know the Fed has things to say about its dollars, but not as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, that's only if I'm in America, right? Here I can use, if you accept dollars, you'll accept dollars. You don't have to, because it's not legal tender in Brazil, but if you want to, then we can deal. So inside any national economy, the national currency is the white money, and it's the least productive, least efficient. The black money, so-called, is the international currency of the world. And with those kind of ideas, we're nearly there. The victim will always be national economics. And if you know, again, this starts out as a piece of national economic thinking. How do I manage the economy of my country? So we have monetary policy here, and we have foreign exchange problem there. This I can't control, your jurisdiction. But I think the brilliance of, if I understand Milton Friedman, there is a certain brilliance in it. If we all do this, bar none, then my monetary policy stops the inflation, stops the foreign exchange markets being disastrous or being uncontrolled. Yeah. It had huge consequences, because then you would break the foreign exchange market as an opportunity for speculating. But even there, Soros said, it's so interesting what he said. He gave a TV interview some time ago, and he was asked by Timothy Garton Ash, who's an interesting Oxford guy. He said, so why did you bet on the pound in 1992? And why didn't you bet on the French in 1992, before the euro? And his answer was very simple. He said, if you go back to the First World War, everything I've been describing, it's so obvious we live in a single economy with a multiplicity of currencies. And what there should be in a single economy is one currency. but we don't know which one it is. But it's going to be one. It has to be. It's already, implicitly it is one. And so it was so interesting what he said. So what are you doing in the financial markets if you're in the foreign exchange market anyway? You make an image of what you think is going on. You have this basic notion that there is only one currency, so there can't be more than one. So that's already an illusion if there's 174 of them, right? And then you make judgments about the value according to the governments. And then what he said was, so the only way we get to the 174 currencies we have down to the one that implicitly exists is through arbitrage. And what he said was, so I was looking at two things. Every moment of arbitrage brings us to the point of a single global currency. That's why we do it. So he said, if you don't understand that, get out of the markets, because we don't know when that's going to come into effect. And then he said, as regards to the pound, the reason I bet against the pound is because that would get rid of one currency in Europe with 11 to go. Because in his mind, you've got to get rid of all the currencies of the world. They're not stable. There's only one currency in the world, we don't know which one it is. So he was saying, in principle, we're heading for one currency, so anyone we can get rid of will advance the process. And in his judgment, we can get rid of the pound, right? But we don't want to get rid of the French, right? We do that when we get to the euro. Because when the euro came into being, we lost 15 currencies, and now we've lost 27 currencies. So we're just advancing to the point of which one currency. So it's all this, I just love this stuff, obviously, right? Because it's kind of going on, but we just don't have the vocabulary or we're just a bit behind the curve explaining what's happening. Yeah. But it's not so, I don't think it's so difficult to understand. The main problem is the institutional consequences. You know, and at Brasilia, it was interesting. The guy there, can't remember his name now. He said, "Well, yeah, we're not like Argentina, so we're not so stupid as to link our currency to the dollar, right, and not share seigniorage." That's an interesting little comment he made. And we're free beings or whatever he used. And he said, but we have to deal with institutional problems, meaning that the whole civil service in Brazil, as I understood it, has got used to getting a full pension and retiring at 50. And this, we need a generation to solve this problem. And that's what I mean by institutional. You can bring in policies, right? But if you don't adjust the country, or you don't adjust them to the country in a real way, you're just going to cause grief. Or like your conto movimento, what was it called? The conto movimento, where before the stabilization, if I made losses, I brought my losses to the central bank and I got money.
Conto movimento.
Yeah, this has to go out the window. Before then, it was easy to make money in Brazil. Now it's terrible, right? But of course it's easy to make money if you make a loss and you swap it for cash, right? That's what Goldman Sachs does all the time, right? It's not rocket science, right? But things like that, I think are such good fun because so eventually you did it, yeah? But you came out of your Vargas mindset, your avuncular consciousness in Brazil. I say very, very tentatively, because I think that's such a wonderful thing. Whatever else you say about Brazil or the dictatorship and all this stuff, what I perceive is what I call the Vargas mindset. Yeah? You were, you came from Portugal, like many of the countries in South America. You were not yet free of your king. In Spain, in Argentina, it's much more get rid of the king and all that kind of stuff. But in Brazil, how I perceive it, you went into an avuncular mindset. You know, so I can't get my money from my father, but I've got a kind uncle. Yeah, and that's how I understood what I call the Vargas mindset. Until it's a bit rude of me to say it, but that was my sense. Until behind this stabilization in 1994, it wasn't just politics. Something must have happened in Brazil where you could become free of your uncle. Yeah? And therefore all the all the benefits he could give you or not give you. I call this Vargas economics. Yeah? And I'm just trying to be, not trying to be political. That's part of your history. And I can't understand how Brazil could have made the changes it made in the 1990s. Right? If not, they're not going to go along with the policy.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
I think
We can wrap.
finish. So I wanted to thank you very much.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Oh, okay, thank you.
Thank you for the.
Yeah, thanks all for coming.
And I learned a lot. I don't know if everybody did the same, but
yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, cool.